Imagine this. A cold morning in the 1830s England. Hundreds of hungry orphans sit at an empty table, their stomachs growling. They bow their heads to pray, but there's no food in sight. At the head of the table stands a man, calm, unshaken. He believes God will provide. And then, a knock at the door changes everything. Welcome to the incredible story of George Müller, a man who trusted God to care for over 10,000 orphans, without ever asking for a single penny. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a tale of radical faith, miraculous provision, and a legacy that challenges us all to believe in something greater. Today, we're diving into Müller's life, reimagined through the lens of anime, where every moment of struggle and triumph comes to life. So, grab a seat, and let's journey back to the 19th century, where faith defied the impossible. George Müller wasn't always the faith-filled man we know today. Born in 1805 in Prussia, modern-day Germany, he started as a wild child. Picture this, a young George, sneaking out to gamble, drink, and even steal. He was the last person you'd expect to become a protector of orphans. But everything changed when George was 20. He stumbled into a small prayer meeting, more out of curiosity than faith. What he found there shook him to his core. For the first time, George saw people who lived what they believed. They weren't just talking about God, they were trusting him with their whole lives. George gave his life to Christ that day, and soon he felt a calling to show the world that God could be trusted completely. In 1832, he left Prussia for England, a land teeming with poverty and orphans. Back then, the Industrial Revolution had left countless children homeless. Many were forced into workhouses, grim places where they were treated more like slaves than kids. George couldn't stand it. He believed these children deserved more, a home, a family, a chance to know God's love. But here's the crazy part. George decided he wouldn't ask anyone for money, not a single penny. Instead, he'd rely entirely on prayer. Could God really provide for hundreds, even thousands of orphans through faith alone? In 1836, George opened his first orphanage in Bristol. It started small, just a house for 30 girls. But George had a vision, to care for as many orphans as God would provide for. And provide God did, in ways that seemed impossible. But it wasn't always easy. Some days the pantry was bare. No bread, no milk, nothing. George refused to borrow money or beg for help. Instead, he gathered the children to pray. God will provide, he'd say, his voice steady, even when his heart must have raced. One morning, the orphanage ran out of milk. The children sat at the table, hungry, praying with George. Just as they said, "Amen," there was a knock at the door. A milkman stood outside. His cart had broken down, and he needed to offload the milk before it spoiled. "Take it all," he said. The children cheered, their prayers answered, right on time. Stories like these became the heartbeat of George's work. Bread arrived when the ovens were cold. Clothes came when the children's shoes were worn through. Over the years, George's faith grew stronger, and so did the need. By the 1840s, he was caring for hundreds of orphans, eventually building 5 massive orphanages in Bristol to house over 2,000 children at a time. But the bigger the mission, the bigger the challenges. Some people mocked George. "He's crazy," they said. "You can't run an orphanage on prayers." Others accused him of secretly fundraising. And then there were the days when provision didn't come right away. George faced sleepless nights, wondering if he'd made the right choice. Could he really keep trusting God, even when the stakes were so high? Yet George held fast. He believed God's timing was perfect, even when it tested every ounce of his faith. And time after time, that faith was rewarded in ways that left everyone in awe. One of George's most famous stories happened in 1857. The orphanage now housed over 300 children, and they were completely out of food. Not a crumb left. George gathered the children to pray, just as he always did. "Our Father in heaven," he began, "we thank you for what you're about to provide." The children looked up, confused. The table was empty, but George, he believed. That same morning, a baker in Bristol woke up at 2 a.m. He couldn't sleep. A strange feeling told him to bake bread for Müller's orphans. By sunrise, he arrived at the orphanage with enough bread to feed everyone. Moments later, another donor showed up with milk and cheese. The children's prayers were answered again. Over his lifetime, George Müller cared for over 10,000 orphans. He never took a salary, he never went into debt, and he never asked for money. Every need, every single one, was met through prayer. By the time he died in 1898, George had built a legacy that proved one thing: God could be trusted, completely. George's story isn't just about miracles. It's about a man who chose faith over fear, trust over doubt. He showed the world that God's provision isn't a fairy tale, it's real. And his work didn't stop with him. The orphanages he built continued for decades, and his story still inspires millions today. George Müller's life reminds us of something powerful. Faith can move mountains, or in his case, feed thousands of hungry children. From a reckless young man in Prussia to a faith-filled protector of orphans in England, George showed us what it means to trust God with everything. His story isn't just history, it's a challenge. What would happen if we lived with that kind of faith today? So, what's your takeaway? Maybe it's a renewed trust in God's timing. Maybe it's a call to care for the vulnerable in your own life. Whatever it is, George Müller's story proves that faith isn't just a feeling, it's a choice. And it can change the world. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of faith. Thank you for your time.